And yes, I'm Norma Levy, New Plaza's president, and we are a not-for-profit community of film lovers. Gary Palmucci, our curator, has chosen for today's talk the suspenseful 1944 film called Double Indemnity, based on a book by James M. Cain. The screenplay is credited to Raymond Chandler. Gary will be joined in this talkback by our wonderful film historian, Max Alvarez, and by two special friends, the documentarian and author, Stephen C. Smith, and the filmmaker, Dan Cahill. Thank you for coming. And Gary, please begin.
Thank you, Norma. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Well, like many of you joining us today, I think I've seen Double Indemnity a few times over the years. Once accompanied by Buster Keaton's immortal short, Cops, which I guess had some connection in that theater's programming. But this time around, I really had this remarkable feeling of being like present at the creation of one of the great genres in movie history, film noir, this remarkable, grubby, visually resplendent genre that just keeps on giving 75 years probably after its first examples came out. And I think Double Indemnity feels so quintessential in that regard, and a screenplay that really is just remarkable for virtually every line of narration, every exchange of dialogue, just cutting to the quick with rueful truth or uproarious humor, sometimes a combination thereof. Really remarkable. No one, Max, can disagree with that, right?
No, and I have to say, Gary, I've always admired Double Indemnity. I've enjoyed it. I've appreciated it, but I didn't absolutely love it as much as I did revisiting it the other evening. And I had the great fortune of doing I was almost as though I was a student of the opera going to hear a great opera being performed and reading the sheet music. I actually read a published version of the Wilder screenplay as I was watching the film, and that was so enlightening. And we can talk more about how it followed the script, but it was truly a remarkable achievement. And for all the reasons that you've mentioned, and the fact that in watching this film, even after you've seen hundreds of crime pictures from this era, that dialogue, the Billy Wilder, Raymond Chandler dialogue just leaps off the screen in ways that we're not used to hearing. It's truly remarkable for what people are saying as it is for what we're watching on screen.
Murder that smelled like honeysuckle, the guy who sleeps in a bed with 4 rattlesnakes.
Everything is in there. And our guests today are going to be talking more about the influences for the film, of course, the James Cain novel, and what, if any, changes were made from page to screen. But the dialogue, and it's even more remarkable when we have to remind ourselves that it really wasn't that long ago before the film was made when Billy Wilder, the director and co-writer, didn't speak any English. And this is the most American sounding Hollywood picture you can imagine of its time.
He came to the US in the mid 30s?
Late 30s. So Wilder's situation was he was doing very well in Germany as a screenwriter, having, of course, come by way of Poland and Eastern Europe. He's there in the 1920s in Berlin during a very exciting cultural time. He, of course, has to leave in 1933 with the rise of Hitler. He's in France for a short time where he co-directs a wonderful film called Mauvais Grain, Bad Seed, about car thieves, which anticipates the new wave. And then he comes to Hollywood in the mid-30s and is going to be already writing screenplays by 1936 or thereabouts, and mastering English, in part due to his frequent collaborator, Charles Brackett, who helps him with the language.
He had some Holocaust-related tragedy, I believe, as well. He lost some of his family.
He lost his mother. He lost pretty much most of his relatives who were in Austria. He had gone back to Vienna at the end of 1935 to get people to leave, and they just didn't they couldn't understand why there was why he saw them in dangerous situation. And it's very, very sad. So obviously there's a tension hanging over all his subsequent pictures, even the comedies, very, very dark, etched in acid. And yet
to give you an example of his very singular sense of humor, I recall reading in Film Comment magazine in the mid-70s, he's being interviewed in his office in LA, and there's a cutout of Hitler on the wall over the desk of his office, and the menu for a Los Angeles kosher delicatessen pinned directly into Hitler's crotch. And I guess that was his.
That is known as a Billy Wilder joke. He was
Yes.
he benefited from what was known as the Berliner lip, this tremendously dark, sarcastic sense of humor that carried into his films, of course. This is going to be his third successive hit as a director at Paramount Pictures. He started out with the comedy The Major and the Minor. He follows that with a wartime action picture, Five Graves to Cairo, and then he makes this, Double Indemnity. Should we take a peek at how Paramount Pictures sold it?
Means.
All right, so this is the original trailer for Billy Wilder's third feature film in Hollywood as a director, Double Indemnity.
I killed Dietrichson. Me, Walter Neff, insurance agent, 35 years old, unmarried, no visible scars. Until a while ago, that is. Yeah, I killed him. I killed him for money and for a woman. It all began last May. I was thinking about that dame upstairs and the way she had looked at me. And I wanted to see her again, close, without that silly staircase between us. How could I have known that murder can sometimes smell like honeysuckle?
I can't stand it anymore. What if they do hang me?
They're not going to hang you, baby.
It's better than going on this way.
They're not going to hang you. Because you're going to do it and I'm going to help you.
Yes, from the moment they met, it was murder. But always behind them, with his devilish hunches and his brilliant brain, was Keyes.
The murder's never perfect. Always comes apart sooner or later. And where two people are concerned, it's usually sooner.
Could they get away from him and his relentless pursuit? And could they get away with murder?
You don't know Keyes. Once he gets his teeth into something, he never lets go. He'll investigate you. He'll have you shouted. He'll watch you every minute from now on. You afraid, baby?
Yes, I'm afraid. But not of Keyes. I'm afraid of us.
I'd like to move in on her right now, tonight. If it wasn't for Norton and his striped pants ideas about company policy, I'd have the cops after her so quick it'd make a head spin. Now, we know the Dietrichson dame is in it, and somebody else.
Only you haven't got a single thing to go on, Keyes.
He'll show, he's got to show. Sometime, somewhere, they've got to meet.
There was a whole troubled history of getting this film brought to the screen, and Stephen Smith, who we'll introduce shortly, is going to tell us more about that. I have to say, Gary, all these years I had been regretting Fred McMurray being cast in this picture, because I know they were talking about John Garfield, but watching it again, I actually found him to be tremendously effective and believable in that part.
I think he's terrific.
He is, and Wilder very shrewdly cast him and Edward G. Robinson against their usual parts. McMurray was known for lighthearted comedy. Robinson, of course, known for playing heavies. And here, Robinson is a somewhat heroic role, and it's McMurray who's the heavy here.
But was Robinson having some difficulty with Warner Brothers at this point? Is that what he was doing over there at the Paramount?
I'm not sure how the whole loan out thing worked, but let's just say Jack Warner didn't see Robinson as a long-term investment. He thought Robinson had sort of had peaked after his initial crime picture wave in the early 1930s. So Robinson, I imagine, which was not uncommon among movie stars at Warner Brothers, was getting pretty frustrated over there. And this is so obviously some loan out must have been arranged.
Well, I think we've on this program we've heard about Jack Warner tussling with actors and actresses, and sometimes to his benefit and sometimes to his loss. I think this is one of those.
Definitely. And Barbara Stanwyck had been forging such an effective screen career because she didn't sign long-term contracts. She was pretty much a freelancer who only signed contracts for a small number of films with each studio, thereby guaranteeing higher quality scripts, or more, she could have more say in the kinds of pictures she wanted to make. And this is a tremendous role for her as the noir femme fatale.
She's just burning a hole in the screen, and that white sweater that she wears in her initial meeting with Fred McMurray is pushing the envelope of the production code right there. One of probably dozens of aspects of the picture that walk the edge in that regard.
No, definitely. And in looking over the screenplay, and when I say the published screenplay, I mean they literally did publish the screenplay. I don't know if you can see here, but this is the typewritten script that would have been done by Wilder or perhaps some secretary at Paramount. And you can see how densely the details are. This is just describing a scene early on in the film. I'll just give you a tiny quote where the McMurray character, he's with the help of his good hand, he edges his left elbow up to the armrest of the chair, supports it there, and then pulls his jacket wide. I mean, this is the level of detail that Wilder and presumably Chandler go into. And Stephen's going to talk more about all this, but I as I mentioned, the script, the published script, the shooting script is almost word for word for the finished film. There were a couple of trims made to some of the voiceover. One, for example, after an early meeting that Neff has with Philip Dietrichson, the voiceover is, "She liked me, I could feel that. The way you feel when the cards are falling right for you with a nice little pile of blue and yellow chips in the middle of the table. Only what I didn't know that I wasn't playing her, she was playing me with a deck of marked cards, and the stakes weren't any blue and yellow chips, they were dynamite." That didn't make it into the film, but most of the other masterpieces of English language did.
Well, some of our viewers may remember in Barry Levinson's debut film Diner, there's a young man walking through the picture reciting quotes from our beloved Sweet Smell of Success. And I think we could, some independent film could use some, young person walking through the film, just rattling off dialogue from this film, which is just incandescent.
Without question. At this point, perhaps we could bring Stephen Smith in to join us in our conversation. Stephen Smith, for those of you who've been following our programs, gave a fabulous presentation the other night at New Plaza Cinema on Murder for Sale, James M. Cain in Hollywood. He's a 4-time Emmy-nominated documentarian and author. He's written 2 biographies, one on Max Steiner, one on Bernard Herrmann, who he's spoken about before at New Plaza. He's produced and written, if you can believe this, over 200 documentaries for TV and other media, documentaries ranging from The Sound of Music to Martin Scorsese on Lawrence of Arabia, to, and this is very timely, West Side Story, and a documentary on pre-code Hollywood and early censorship. Needless to say, Stephen Smith, welcome back to New Plaza Cinema. We're thrilled to have you to talk about Double Indemnity.
Thrilled to be with you, such good company, and everyone out there. And it just reminds me that I had the privilege of interviewing Billy Wilder and Miklos Rocha in the 1980s, which was a lot of fun. But yes, I love this film, and I know time is brief, and we want to make sure there's time for you and Dan and questions. I just wanted to say what a tremendous game changer this movie was in Hollywood, because people may not realize that there were movies made before and after Double Indemnity. And by that, I mean that until this film was made, the novels of James M. Cain were thought to be unfilmable. And the notion of having sympathetic killers as your main characters, yes, they're punished, but that was something that Joseph Breen of the Production Code Administration simply would not allow. MGM in 1934 had published Cain's first big success, his novel, The Postman Always Rings Twice. And that same year, the code was being enforced, censorship, and there was no way that MGM could make that movie. And that's how the studios felt about anything of that nature, the stories of people that we like for most of the way. killing someone. And especially another thing that was explicit in the code was that you could not show the details of how a murder was committed. And that affected so many movies where screenwriters, producers, and directors would fight with Joe Breen and his staff. But that was an absolutely verboten thing. You could not show the process. Well, this movie is all about two charismatic people taking us through the process of how they kill. And the way so how did it get done? Well, I think World War II had a lot to do with that. There were shifting sensibilities. Movies were starting to get darker. The news was getting darker. And Wilder and Chandler, who was very much a collaborator on this, I mean, it was, I think, a 50-50 script. They managed to persuade Breen that there was sufficient retribution of these characters that and even though we saw how the crime was committed, that we would also see how it failed, how ultimately people who, smart people defeat the killers. And that all sounds fine for the code, and it's part of me, the genius of film noir is you can have the right ending, which is to say people we care about die, they lose, and that also satisfies the censors because to them, these are people who should be punished. So it was the ingenuity and the boldness of Wilder to really push this through and his collaboration with Chandler. And you were talking about Edward G. Robinson. This was the first film in which Robinson was a supporting player. He was still a star. And that's another reason that I think that the script is so good, was that Wilder knew he had to make the part of Keyes a great one to get Robinson in the film. And in the novel, the James M. Cain novel, which was written in 1936, 7 years before this film, Keyes is not he's not character number 3 in the story. He and Walter are not close. At the end of the book, when Keyes finds out that Walter is the killer, he says, "I sort of liked you." And that sums it up. Whereas in the movie, for me, it is a father-son relationship that Keyes, who it's so clearly established, cannot trust anyone, never has a relationship because he can't put his trust in people, is addicted, obsessed with his work. I think he sees in Walter someone who's going to basically carry on his life when he retires and in effect be his son. There are numerous essays, you can find them in books online, talking about it as a homoerotic relationship. The beauty of movies is you can see what you want to see, but I don't see that in this at all. Plenty of film noir movies have that, but for me it's a very poignant one for a different reason, because Keyes really does love Walter. It's, as they used to say, kidding on the square when they keep saying, "I love you too." So that's the reason that Robinson's in it and that the Keyes part is so good. And it was the genius of Wilder and Chandler figuring out that the story was so much stronger if Keyes is having conversations with Walter saying, "I'm going to find who this man is," and that we know it's going to break Keyes' heart. It isn't just that he's getting closer to the truth. And it was also a game changer in that this movie established the sound of film noir. And it's sort of a misnomer in the public mind that the sound of film noir is a jazzy saxophone, and small jazz combo. That's really the sound of detectives on television in the 50s, things like Peter Gunn. And yes, there's a little of that in 50s noir. But with this film, Miklos Rocha, who had worked with Wilder before, really establishes the template of what noir is going to sound like all through the 1940s. Rocha will go on to score The Killers, Crisscross, and so many others. And so this movie is so important in so many ways. It even scared Barbara Stanwyck a little, supposedly, that most fearless of actresses, because even though she had played unsympathetic characters, I think that by the end of the movie, we're always on her side again, and there has been an arc of her coming around. And supposedly there was a moment where she wasn't sure she wanted to do this, and Wilder claimed he said to her, and the quote varies on the source, "Are you an actress or a mouse?" And that got her back. And Fred MacMurray, as you pointed out, he was Tom Hanks in 1943, which was the other great thing, except that now actors are more comfortable about playing villains than they used to be. In those days, you simply didn't break away from an identity that a studio may have spent years and years investing and creating. It's something that Cary Grant, with all of his power, was afraid to do. He in one famous movie chose not to be a murderer, and yet in this case, MacMurray did. And so those are some of the reasons I think this film is so important.
I remember in 1984 at USC, they were doing a Billy Wilder retrospective. Maybe you were there, maybe we were both there.
That's where I interviewed.
Oh, that's okay. So we were there at the same time. That's amazing. Well, it was the screening of The Apartment where Wilder was there with Fred McMurray. And I'll never forget Fred McMurray was recalling getting involved with Double Indemnity. He said, yeah, it was the first time I was called to actually act. And certainly he did. A couple of things, Stephen. Could you share your theories as to why the movie takes place in 1938? What was the point of that? And also, it occurred to me, Miklos Rocha's score is pretty laid back for a score that he often did at that time. When you can think of The Killers, which is a lot more intense and prominent, the Double Indemnity score is kind of in the background. I'd love to hear your thoughts on both those things.
Yes. Well, talking about Rocha first, this was a controversial score at the studio, and just to show you how conservative Hollywood was in its thinking, and Paramount was known. We think of it as Lubitsch and glossy, and Lubitsch wasn't the biggest box office earner, but it is true that Paramount was about beautiful, soft focus filmmaking a lot of the time, and this is such a more harsh film, just as Five Graves to Cairo had been in Billy Wilder's previous film for Paramount. And the musical director was very conservative at Paramount, and Rocha writes in his autobiography about how he was fought every step of the way against writing and recording this score as written because it was so dissonant. And Rocha stuck to his guns, and the score was used. And then at the preview, when someone important stepped over to the group and said, boy, the music was terrific too, the first person to jump in was that musical director, say, yes, I thought that this was the way to go on the film. And Rocha, who was a very strong but diplomatic person, just sort of smiled and thought, well, that's Hollywood for you, which is why he sort of spent part of his life in Hollywood and part of it not. And yes, so this movie establishes the sound of noir. And then when you have Mark Hellinger producing the Killers and Siad Mack, and they're emboldened by this film to be even more extreme, I think that you get that even bigger Rocha sound. But yeah, the score is beautifully subtle, and I think it's a sign of how well it works. Is that right before you have that sequence at the Hollywood Bowl, there is Rocha's music playing, and it segues quietly into Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, which we're listening to, which is a very mysterious minor key opening, and it almost sounds like the score is continuing. It's so beautifully conceived. And as we've talked about before, Gary and Max, I love how the main title is this kind of death march. And of course, the film accompanies it with a shadow of a silhouette of a man walking towards the camera, shot especially for the main title. And then we hear that music at the end, and it tells us it tells us what's going to happen next to Walter Neff. Let's just say that.
Well, it reflects that line about midway through the picture when he suddenly realizes that he's walking along and he feels like it was the walk of a dead man. Something had happened.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I think exactly, Gary. And I think that was the cue that Miklos Rocha took and ran with so beautifully in writing this score.
Well, I have to thank you also. I've been mispronouncing his name all my adult life. I'm calling him Rosa. Yeah, this is so. Yeah, thanks Rocha, for that too.
And then any thoughts on the 1938 setting?
Oh, yes. The 1938, it had to happen before the war. The war just complicated everything story-wise because even in Laura, which was made in 1944, same year, there was a reference to World War II that Fox subsequently cut out on a reissue. And there was something about how they felt that the story would work better if it was not taking place in a time when all these other things were happening. So it was a way of setting it in the past so that you weren't going to be distracted by other things, even though it was the very, very recent past. And in a way, Mildred Pierce does the same thing. We just don't really know it because the story starts when Vita's quite young. So like the book, it's really taking place at the beginning in the 1930s, but it's just more subtly done. And it's pretty subtle here too.
Very subtle, very subtle. Well, we've been getting a sense of the music and the dialogue of Double Indemnity. Now we're going to get more of a sense of the visual look of the film. I would like to bring Dan Cahill, our amazing New Plaza supporter and contributor in. Dan he's a filmmaker. He's taught filmmaking at the New York Film Academy. And Dan, we'd love to hear what you have to say about the look of Double Indemnity. Welcome back, of course.
Hi, guys.
Hey, Dan.
I'm going to plunge right in and share my screen if you'll give me a few seconds here. I am going to, let's see, I've got far too many things to queue up here. And let's go now to the slideshow. There we are. So here we are with the title with that marvelous dirge march of death. It tells you that doom is coming at the end of this movie, as it indeed does. A lot of my presentation today is going to deal with Fred MacMurray, who, as we've said, didn't really think he would be good for this role, but it's sort of the role of a lifetime for him. I also, in dealing with the look of the film, want to deal with one of the best storytelling devices is the look on Fred MacMurray's face, specifically how he uses his eyes in reacting to certain dramatic moments in the film. And we'll come to that. Also, just in passing, note that dark spot on his left shoulder. We'll talk about that later. One thing we've talked about in this month of Noirvember is the tropes of film noir, things that recur all the time. And we couldn't let this go by without a movie which is literally a riot of Venetian blinds. I would invite the audience to try to figure out how many different light sources there are that have Venetian blinds in front of them. I lose count in this particular image. Also, just an indication of how they overdid it. The observation platform in the back of the train even has Venetian blinds over its window, an extremely unlikely place to put them, in my opinion. One thing we have talked about recently is using the noun ankle as a verb. Indeed, when we talk about Joan Crawford in the slang of daily variety, ankling metro or ankling a contract, that's what we mean, someone leaving. But here we have Barbara Stanwyck ankling her way into a scene, wearing the soon-to-be very fetishized anklet on her lovely ankle. Speaking of Barbara Stanwyck, this is a scene in Walter Neff's very dark kitchen. Someone needs to buy him an extra light bulb, but this is an indication of low-key lighting. Now, we all use the terms high key and low key in our ordinary conversation. It's come into that usage, but in film, the key light is the main light that's lighting the actor's face. And in this case, it's very low illumination. You can see that the top and back lights are brighter than the lights on her face. Hence the expression low key lighting, which makes her look all the more mysterious. This is just another example. A short while later, the overall scene is brighter because she's sitting next to a floor lamp, but still her face is the darkest part of the frame. And she is one of the darkest people in the story. Here's one of Fred's first looks. This comes after he has just knowingly invited the unknowing Mr. Diedrichson to sign a request for double indemnity accident insurance. And he's giving a look of acknowledgement to Phyllis, who's sitting right across the room. This is Phyllis Diedrichson in a dark car as she is listening to the sound of her husband's neck being broken by her lover. And it's a very subtle shot, but you can tell when you look at it for long enough that she has finally arrived at a moment she has been dreaming about for quite some time. Here they are a few moments later. Once again, the look on MacMurray's face is basically an, oh Lord, what's going on kind of expression because the car won't start. Now they get around it soon enough, but the look on his face is enough to tell you that something's wrong. Here is the Walk of a Dead Man scene that Gary was just quoting. And he stops, he's on his way to the deli to buy some food to establish his alibi for being home that evening. And he suddenly realizes, oh my gosh, this whole thing could collapse on me any minute now. Here we are again, we resume his dictaphone confession. And I want to point out that that little spot on his shoulder is now much bigger. The wound that he suffered is bleeding. And this is sort of a chronicle of where we are in the film, where we are in what may be the last hours of Walter Neff's life as the stain gets bigger on his jacket. This is, as Stephen referenced, in my opinion, one of the best aspects of the script, which really deepens the characters, this father-son relationship. And it is emblematic of the relationship that Walter has become a support for Keyes in lighting his cigar. Keyes never can seem to find a match, and Walter's always there flicking it off on his thumb. This is the sequence where, well, very strangely, the apartment door opens out into the hallway. I've never seen one like that, never visited an apartment like that or lived in one, but they use it here for a very purposeful reason, which is that Phyllis is hiding outside the apartment. If they had to have the door swing in, the scene would have had to be very, very different. And I love this moment. Again, Walter's eyes are telling us, oh yeah, she's right behind the door, because she has just nudged the door a little bit to tell him that she's there. Another one of the great subtle moments in this story. Here is another moment where Lola, Phyllis's stepdaughter, is telling Walter about how Phyllis may have killed her natural mother years ago when she was supposedly nursing her. And Walter's eyes tell you everything. Oh my gosh, am I in league with another bad person? And here we have Walter reacting after his last scene of conflict with Phyllis in Jerry's Market, which, by the way, has no Venetian blinds. I don't know what got into them there. Here is almost the last scene of the film, and I'll tell you why almost in a minute, but here the roles reverse, and Walter is so seriously wounded that he can't find a match. Keyes has one ready for him. And this is the last shot of the movie that we have seen. However, there was another scene written into the script and filmed, which was discarded after some preview screenings. This is the only frame that survives of that sequence, which the entire thing, I believe, is rumored to be somewhere buried in the vaults at Paramount. But this is Walter Neff meeting his death in the gas chamber and observed by Keyes. And I want to share with you, I'm going to take just a moment to go back on screen, because I want to share with you the last minute of the story as originally written to follow that gas chamber scene. 1 minute from the end of the script. Keyes comes slowly out into the dark, narrow corridor. His hat is on his head now. His overcoat is pulled around him loosely. He walks like an old man. He takes 8 or 10 steps, then mechanically reaches a cigar out of his vest pocket and puts it in his mouth. His hands, in the now familiar gesture, begin to pat his pockets for matches. Suddenly he stops, with a look of horror on his face. He stands rigid, pressing a hand against his heart. He takes the cigar out of his mouth and goes slowly on toward the door, camera panning with him. When he has almost reached the door, the guard there throws it wide and a blaze of sunlight comes in from the prison yard outside. Keyes slowly walks out into the sunshine, stiffly, his head bent, a forlorn and lonely man. Fade out, the end. So that was the original intention of Wilder and Chandler, to end the film even more tragically than it ends in the present version. I will not render a judgment on whether or not they should have included that scene. Obviously, audiences didn't care for it. Maybe it was too much to have a double tragedy. But gentlemen, I will invite you all back on screen, please, and get your reactions to that.
Dan, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I remember many years ago reading an essay on Double Indemnity where they did mention that deleted sequence you mentioned, Dan, and the writer, the academic, and I forget who it was, actually said the general consensus has been that it was wise to discard the ending because it was redundant. But the writer argued that actually, had they included it, it would have caused the audience to really question the whole role of death versus state-sanctioned murder. So the killing of Phyllis Dietrichson's husband was an evil act, but the killing of Neff was an act of justice, and it would have caused us to question the deaths of both characters. It's an interesting theory, anyway.
God forbid anyone should challenge the death penalty in America, but Hey, these were
There's-
iconoclastic
yeah.
writers.
There's an inescapable echo too of what was happening in the war at the time. Although this movie was shot between September and November of 1943, but things were starting to be known. This morning I watched an interview with Wilder that he did at the AFI, and it says pretty much what he said on multiple occasions. And although he could frequently tell tall tales, as all good filmmakers do in being interviewed, I believe him on this one when he said we watched it at the preview and we just knew when the movie was over. It told us when the movie was over, and it was over with the two men there. He said we knew what was going to happen to him after that. We didn't have to show it. So, I think that the quietness of that ending as Rocha's music builds is just stunning.
Plus, and forgive me, Dan, if you hadn't mentioned this already, that's when we see Keyes flicking the match himself with his finger.
Oh, yeah. Their roles have reversed right at the last shot of the film.
And closer than that. What a great last line to go out of.
Closer than that.
Yeah. Keyes says something about, I feel very close to you, or something, another bond of affection between these two guys.
In the screenplay, Dan, the shot that you mentioned, that's so powerful. It's the shot of Phyllis's face as the neck is being broken. I forgot how disturbing that still is. It's still a shocker. And I found the part in the screenplay where they describe it, and it says close up dash Phyllis's face only as the murder is taking place. And there's another, this is a screenwriting joke that I found very amusing. In a screenplay, as many people know, when there is a gunshot, an explosion, a loud noise, usually it's printed out in all capital letters, often in its own paragraph, so that people reading the script will know. There's nothing like that in the scene where Phyllis shoots Neff by the window. And I'm watching this on TV the other night, and I'm looking for it in the script, and I said, there's nothing about a gunshot here. Well, I looked at it closer this morning. Buried in that description of the scene is the sentence, I quote, "There is the report of a gun," close quote.
That sounds like Raymond Chandler.
Yeah.
You have to squint to really find out that a gunshot has been fired in that scene. I just thought that was fascinating. Do we know? Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, well, speaking of Phyllis and her characterization, in the book, Kane, and I give all James M. Kane all the credit in the world, because the story that we see is the story of the book. But in the book, Phyllis Dietrichson is a psychotic serial killer. She has killed, I believe, 8 people before Walter catches on to her. And there's this very, for Kane, overwritten passage, because he's famously terse in his dialogue. But she talks about being in love with death and how she thinks of herself as death. And at the end, when she and the book are going to, she and Walter commit suicide, she's saying, I'm going to be back with my true love and all of that. It's really just unplayable. And they made her character so much better. And much like Frank in Postman Always Rings Twice, who's a man who's had violence in his life before then, the Walter in the book is rather amoral. And it's not so much a compromise. It's less of a journey, let's say, to have him take part in a murder. He's sort of someone who's ready for something in life to happen to him. So I think they made tremendously smart choices in altering all 3 of the characters.
Very well stated.
Yes, ready at the turn of an anklet, in fact.
Yes.
There's so much great dialogue in the script. Do we know, Stephen, the percentage of the script that bears Wilder's authorship and Chandler's?
We'll never know, because the way Wilder wrote was he walked and paced, and I showed in my presentation him waving that writing crop. In that case, it's Charles Brackett. So the other person, or persons, because there are actually multiple writers on the film. Sunset Boulevard has a 3rd writer that's usually not mentioned. But and I'm not criticizing Wilder's approach, but he liked to act, to think, to move, to say the dialogue, to be physically in movement with that stick, and someone else was at the typewriter, or a stenographer was writing it down. But in terms of percentage of dialogue, for all that they hated each other, and the sad thing is that he and Wilder and Chandler really came to despise each other, and Wilder, who could be pretty harsh, actually was proud, he later said, to get Chandler, who is an alcoholic, off the wagon and get him drinking again, because he made him so miserable. I mean, there's a whole movie You could make a Coen Brothers movie about these two men in a room, and the games they play with each other, particularly Wilder, who was, like all great directors, manipulative. And Chandler was broken, and he broke so much that by the time he wrote his next film, The Black Dahlia, he said, "I have to drink. You just have to let me drink alcohol if I'm going to finish this by such and such a time," according to John Houseman. But anyway, I don't think we'll know the percentage, but in spite of their incredible antipathy toward each other, the artists in them absolutely fused into one, so much so that you can't tell where one starts and the other finishes. I mean, I suspect when you have a real aria, like that great scene of Keyes talking about the different kinds of suicides that have been classified, that I suspect is Billy Wilder. But it's hard not to think, and maybe it's just, maybe this is guesswork, that the first person narration and a lot of the phrases are Chandler, because that's the way he wrote. And also, if you look at Chandler's books like The Big Sleep and Farewell, My Lovely, good luck trying to explain the plot to someone in less than 25 sentences. He didn't even really care that much about the plot, but he cared about characters. So I think there are probably many moments in this movie where there's something that pierces our heart or grabs us with its acerbic power that is Chandler, but that's also Wilder's. So I think it's a credit to them that they were so well matched. It was such the right teaming.
Yeah.
We cannot tell who wrote what.
Seamless.
We should let our audience know that Mr. Chandler, several years later, worked with a guy named Hitchcock on Strangers on a Train. And Hitchcock famously hated the first draft, so that when Chandler came into his office for a conference, Hitch just took it and dumped it in the trash can. So good way to start off a story conference, I think.
Some people have commented that you see what appears to be a wedding band on Neff's hand during the film. It is my understanding that men did not commonly wear wedding bands at that time. So whether that was supposed to be a class ring or something else is a matter of debate. What I noticed, unless I'm mistaken, he wasn't wearing gloves when he was disposing of the crutches on the railroad track. That was very sloppy of Neff. He should have been careful about the fingerprints issue.
I thought I saw gloves on his hands. Maybe I'm wrong.
You may be right, Dan. You may be right.
Well, we'll all have to watch the movie again just to see that. Okay.
With pleasure.
But if anything, this certainly shows the range and versatility of Billy Wilder's work. So he's going from a comedy in 1942 to a war action picture the following year to this film noir. And then The Lost Weekend follows the year after. It's this tremendous, tremendous range of work.
And then perhaps his most ill-fated film, The Emperor Waltz, with Bing Crosby, I think also made it Paramount.
Exactly. And then he does A Foreign Affair.
I want to give some credit to a really marvelous biography of Mr. Wilder by Ed Sickoff. It's about 20 years old, but well worth looking for. And there are so many Wilder films that are worth watching, but I want to put in a special plug for one of my secret favorites is Five Graves to Cairo, the predecessor to this. You get to see Erich von Stroheim playing Erwin Rommel. I mean, it's brilliant casting, and it just works.
At the time that Rommel is fighting the war with us, which was really, that was a daring thing to do, was to sort of sympathetically, or at least portray as a human being, someone we were at war with at the time.
Oh, yeah.
By von Stroheim,
yeah.
One of his hardest films to see for a long time before the home video era, but we've caught up with all of them now.
Finally, and because Wilder was always getting into, he loved ruffling feathers, and you gentlemen have talked about the challenges Double Indemnity faced with censors, and then he's going to arouse the ire of the Office of War Information when he makes A Foreign Affair. They're very offended by his sarcastic portrayal of the U.S. occupation of post-war Berlin, and it goes on and on. He was a director who embraced controversy in his work in a very commercial framework.
Loved it.
The legendary account of when Louis B. Mayer came out of a screening of Sunset Boulevard, I guess, and started dressing him down, and Wilder responded with a single two-word expletive beginning with F.
Yes, because Mayer was accusing Wilder of biting the hand that feeds him, and Wilder made short business of Mayer in that sense.
One other thing from this biography that I just referenced, apparently Wilder was so proud of Double Indemnity, and it was a box office hit. And he kind of went around the studio lot bragging about the film, which didn't hurt his career at all. He got a lot of plum stuff right after that. So sometimes that helps.
And it was nominated for several Academy Awards. It lost out to the long forgotten Going My Way by Leo McCarey. And apparently after Double Indemnity was released, Wilder actually received a note from Alfred Hitchcock praising him on the picture. That's something not a lot of people received from Hitchcock.
And yes, I was about to say that's very, very unusual for Hitchcock. And yes, and we should see those 7 Oscar nominations, by the way, as a tremendous win, because even though it lost them all, I mean, Paramount, the same studio, Going My Way was a lock because Crosby was so popular and that movie made so much money, and Crosby had made so much money for the war, and it was just kind of everybody's turn on that movie. Billy Wilder was furious he didn't win, but going from a movie that people said couldn't be made for 8 years to having a Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay nomination, I mean, it was phenomenal that it got that attention, and I'm sure that Wilder could not have made The Lost Weekend the next year without it. And so forth, and certainly Sunset Boulevard. And I think, by the way, that the screenplay of Double Indemnity is something of a template for the screenplay of Sunset Boulevard. The way that Walter at the last minute will save the young man, you know, from being the fall guy for the crime and goes down for it, is very much like the ending of Sunset Boulevard.
And their beginnings are very similar, with a car racing through Los Angeles.
Yep.
So,
and a dead man, in effect, telling the story.
yeah.
Before we open things up to questions, I'll leave you with this anecdote. Apparently on Oscar night, when Wilder was at the ceremony and found out that he did not win the Oscar for directing Double Indemnity, and Leo McCarey was named, as Leo McCarey was striding up the aisle, Wilder tripped him. That's according to one bar. I hope it's a true story. I hope it's a true story. In any event, we're going to very shortly take questions and thoughts from the audience. Beforehand, however, what I'm going to be doing is sharing a trailer that's going to be coming up for my December 1st talk for New Plaza on director Bernardo Bertolucci. This is going to be a discussion of Bertolucci's cinematic genius, focusing on his films from Italy. I hope this trailer that you see will convey the epic nature, the operatic nature, the political nature, and the sensual nature of Bertolucci's films. So this is coming up from New Plaza, and I'll be presenting it on December 1st.
La costanza tiranna del cuore detestiamo qual morbo crudele. So che vuole si serve fedele, non d'amore se non v'è libertà, dei mariti il geloso furore e degli amanti le smanie e del rivo. Ancor d'argo i 100 occhi di sfido, se mi punge una qualche ventà a sé, se mi punge una qualche ventà.
You heard Rigoletto. That was Act 1 from Rigoletto, and I want to thank Dan Cahill and his friend Lou Brothers for bringing that beautiful piece of music to my attention. I auditioned every tenor from the 20th century. We selected Mario Lanza, December 1st. So I will now ask Sean, or Lori, to assist me with with questions from the audience.
Sure.
Comments.
All right, we have Joel Steibel. Joel, can you unmute your microphone, and if you'd like to start your video? Joel,
Hi.
there we go.
Thanks. I really like the webinar so far. The scene with Stanwyck and McMurray, where they talk about there's a speed limit in this state. I mean, that's just so fine. And you know, the timing and the writing. Do you have any comments about how they created that?
Stephen, was that from the novel?
I can tell you that not one word of that, if memory serves, is in the book. That is pure Wilder Chandler, and they wanted to establish immediately that the language, the relationships, and of course, preceding that famous exchange, we hear for the first time the phrase "straight down the line," where it's a paraphrase where McMurray's talking about the kind of insurance he sells, and he goes right down the line, and so every character is going to use, say, a variation of that until the end, and that's that subtle notion of the walk to the cemetery again, that there's a line that this is going down. But yes, that famous exchange is Chandler and Wilder sitting in a room, arguing and coming up with that brilliant dialogue. And I think the fact that Wilder knew that he wanted Stanwyck for the part, again, just as he knew that he wanted Robinson for Keyes, he may have had those actors' voices in his heads and written for them. But that's purely original to the film.
And the timing was deliberate too.
Timing was impeccable.
As McMurray says at the end, when he runs out of rejoinders, he says, "Well, that tears it." That ends it beautifully.
Okay, thank you, Joel. The only other hand up we have right now is Rebecca James. So Rebecca, if you could unmute and start your video. So if anyone else wants to ask any questions, please raise your hand now. Otherwise, we'll be ending the Q&A after this.
Thank you. I'm leaving my video off because I got my booster yesterday and it packed more of a wallop than I was expecting.
We understand.
Yes, good. Well, I'm glad I'm not alone. I absolutely love this movie. I've loved it for years to the point where I have a copy on VHS. So I've watched it several times. It still works too. So I watched it on VHS a few times before this lecture. I love the scene in the market. And it's obviously a set. But at the same time, I can't help but notice that it's a market before plastic was invented. Because if you notice the baskets that they're carrying the food in, they're like wicker baskets, and all the food is in tin cans or paper boxes or whatever. So I just found that kind of an interesting detail that I noticed this time. But my question is, there's a woman in that scene who asked them to get something off of a high shelf. And that woman is also in Shadow of a Doubt, Alfred Hitchcock's movie. So what is her name? Does anybody know?
That's a good piece of information. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and Double Indemnity was filmed just after the release of Shadow of a Doubt, so there's probably a connection to the casting there. I think IMDb will have to answer that, but may I say something briefly about that market?
Sure.
That is Jerry's Market, and we see a real exterior that was across the street from Paramount, and the interior was recreated at Paramount Stage 11, I think. So what's fun about the movie is it's also important because there are several brief but important shots that are done on location throughout the film. For example, in Los Angeles, you can go see the Dietrichson house, the exterior at least. And so Jerry's Market was a place that everybody at Paramount knew. So that was almost an in-joke. And yes, so outside is real, inside is a recreation.
Interesting. Thank you.
And this is a perfect point to mention that the film survived a satirical jab by Carl Reiner and Steve Martin in Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, which came out in 1982, where they were inserting Steve Martin into black and white films of the era, and they had him dressing in drag in Barbara Stanwyck's costume to insert him into that scene taking place at the Los Feliz Market in Double Indemnity. Just
Do you recall, Max, who scored that film? Who scored the Carl Reiner film?
I can't.
Final score by Miklos Rocha. Final film of Edith Head.
I remember Edith Head involved. I forgot that Rocha was involved. That's incredible.
He's writing music over his own music since they didn't have split tracks.
That's great.
Well, guys, we have some more questions. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Ann Holtwick. Ann, can you unmute and start your video if you'd like?
Well, I'm not going to start my video because we're not talking about horror films today.
Stop it.
But I would like to ask if you know what the reaction of the actors was to working in this picture, because the performances are great.
Anyone?
I think that by the time they signed on and were filming, they trusted Billy Wilder completely. They they certainly rose to the challenge of it. It was shot on schedule. Wilder was a very efficient filmmaker. He didn't like to do a lot of takes. He didn't want anyone to deviate one word or one syllable from a script, which is part of the reason that Peter Sellers dropped out of Kiss Me Stupid, was because Wilder felt that the script was what you filmed. So I think everything was so prepared, and again, the great old studio system had everything at the ready. It was a very smooth film in production, so far as I've always heard.
And the fact that McMurray worked with Wilder again 16 years later in The Apartment indicates he was happy with the previous experience.
Right. And not afraid to play a total son of a bitch once again, too.
Yes, he was a bastard of a different color or a different type.
Well, I think this movie represents a turning point in Freddie Mac's career, that he started getting a lot more serious roles and wasn't just a light comic guy, although there was My Three Sons and The Absent-Minded Professor. I don't know.
The Egg and I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Follow me, boys.
We're talking way later now.
Next up, we actually have 4 more questions. Tim Burrows, could you start your microphone and your video if you'd like?
Sure. I hope you can see me and I hope you can hear me.
We can.
Yes.
Good. Two things. First of all, I thoroughly enjoyed watching the film again last night. Was sitting with my wife, and there was a comment that she made that if you can imagine watching this, I'm in Scotland. If you can imagine watching this in England or in Scotland in the war, when there was rationing and people were going to the market and seeing all this food on all of the shelves, it must have been quite something for people to see at that time. The only other thought I had with this was, the only thing I thought with the plot was, would this have worked better had they not invoked the double indemnity clause and done this in a different way? But then we would have lost the title. So
that's from the true story it's based on. I should mention briefly that a woman named Ruth Snyder in 1927 and her lover killed her husband after getting him to sign this kind of insurance clause. And they screwed that up so massively from day one that the movie of that would have lasted 3 minutes. But James M. Cain was inspired by that event. Boy, he really milked it. First, he wrote The Postman Always Rings Twice based on it. Then he followed it a little more closely for his story, Double Indemnity, later published in book form.
So the reverse of a copycat crime in that sense.
Yeah. Yes.
And that criminal trial resulted in the electrocution of Ruth, the conniving woman, which is the first time an actual electrocution was photographed on the slide by a reporter who was witnessing it. It's a really grim thing to bring up, but it's
and Stephen showed that photo the other night when he talked about the origins of double indemnity. And I remember, and then James Cagney, his character was obviously inspired by the person who snuck a camera into that execution of Ruth Snyder.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
All right. We have 4 more questions. Mac, can you unmute and start your video if you'd like?
I'm unmuted, right?
You are.
Yes, you are.
And now the video.
Good
Here we
job.
are.
Hello.
So I love this movie. I'm really glad you're featuring it, and I'm really enjoying this discussion, but I can't believe you were going to let us out of the room without talking about the wig.
I was going to bring it up. So you know.
I don't have the quote in front of me. It's funny you mentioned, I don't have the quote in front of me, but apparently when early in production, and Stephen, you can confirm this, didn't some Paramount executives write something like, here we paid for Barbara Stanwyck, and instead we get George Washington. The studio was a little nervous about the wig.
So I heard or read somewhere that there was some talk that Billy Wilder actually purposely gave her that wig, or wanted something like that, because it was not being worn by Barbara Stanwyck. It was being worn by the character she was playing, and that her character would wear such a wig, or some kind of wig, as a revelation that how frustrated she was with her cheapskate husband that she married for his money, but then he turned out to be a cheapskate and wouldn't pay for her hair being done regularly. So she went out and got this wig so she would look, you know, decent. And like her idea of a femme fatale, which, yeah. So
Well,
has anybody else heard that?
There's at least one quote from Wilder later, because he was asked about this often, and I think he got a little defensive about it. And what I am just remembering,
That's
so
all he should.
this is an exact quote, but he says something like, she was a cheap person. She talks about buying. She doesn't know what this perfume she bought in Ensenada was. I wanted to show there was a cheapness behind her. Now, I think it's up to everybody to just decide, is that a filmmaker justifying a choice that that didn't work, or you know, or is that really what he wanted? But yeah, there was some back and forthing on this, and they went with it. That,
you know, because the first time I saw the movie, I thought was like, are they serious? You know, this is like, this wig has to come off at some point. We have to see her real hair, and never happened.
The question is, though, if you weren't that familiar with Barbara Stanwyck, would you have been as distracted? The fact that we don't know Barbara Stanwyck as a blonde, would it have been as distracting for you?
Yes, because it totally looks like a wig.
It's not just the blondness, it's the bang thing.
Yeah, the bangs kind of give it away.
Yeah.
More so, would you say in the early scenes, I think as the film wears on, maybe they got it a little better than maybe when we first see her. But
no. It's really bad hair.
Okay, I'll take your word for it, Lori.
You know, it almost becomes a character itself, you know,
Yeah.
It takes on its own life. So that might, again, my 2 cents.
I like that story, that it's part of her character, that this is you know, trying to reveal something about her. I like that.
Well, I will say that maybe where it started was that in the book, she is someone who has definitely covered up a past of serial killing. She is a serial killer in the book, so maybe that's where they started with that idea.
So she wants to look different or something? You mean like unidentifiable?
Changing her life, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah, that too.
Well, thank you, Matt. All right, we have 2 more, Dollface. Do you want? I don't mean that personally. That's their name. Would you start your video and unmute your mic, please?
Yes. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Loving this webinar. Thank you so very much. I was going to, Mac beat me to the punch. I was going to ask about the wig because I wanted to know, Edith Head was the costume designer. And there's, in the special features on the DVD, in the Shadow of Suspense, they mentioned that Wilder, the wig was Wilder's idea. And I was wondering, was that the case? Was it really Wilder's idea, the wig, or was it Edith Head's?
Well, it's interesting because when we get to hair, does that fall into the makeup category, or is that an extension of costume? It gets a little iffy there. But Wilder would have had to have approval over that.
Absolutely.
Oh, very much so. And when Edith Head worked with Hitchcock, she, to a large extent, was realizing what he wanted his characters to be dressed as. So I think in this case, it was Wilder takes the credit or blame for the wig. I don't think it's an Edith Head choice at all.
Ah, okay.
Although the bangs on the wig look a lot like Edith Head's bangs. I don't know.
Yes, we love Edith, but yes,
love Edith, but really Edith the hair. Come on.
Yes. Thank you, guys.
All right. And our last question as of now is Damian Begley. If you could please unmute your mic and start your video.
Okay, I can't start my video because I'm stealing a few minutes at work, and we don't have a camera on the monitor here. But I want to thank everyone. This is a fantastic Zoom seminar. Holy cow. I wanted to talk about Dawn Harrison's editing on the movie more than any other movie I've seen. The cutaways. Double Indemnity, I think, is the only movie that I could think of having seen where the cutaways actually advance the story. And I've just never seen that done in another movie. And I realize Dawn Harrison can only work with what he's given, but he did such a fantastic job editing the movie. And I wanted to know what you thought of that.
Well, apparently you're not the only one who thinks that, because if I'm not mistaken, the collaboration between Harrison and Wilder Didn't that go into the 60s, people?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they worked together for years, and when Harrison died in the 60s, I think Wilder was devastated because he lost such an important artistic contributor to his work. So
I have to ask, can you give an example of what you mean by a cutaway? A lot of our audience may not know. Are you talking about some of the reaction shots that we had from Fred McMurray or something else?
Yeah, yeah. No, well, that's part of it. And then I don't have specific examples, but just you know, it's shots that only last a few seconds, and they're technically bridging one scene to another. I wish I could be more specific than that, but usually a cutaway is just to give the audience a little bit of a breather. But this one just kept the story going. It was just amazing to me.
well, it sounds like you're one of those eagle-eyed movie audiences, and there aren't many, who can tell when a cutaway is made to add power to a scene or where they're trying to cover a mistake. And you didn't get the sense, it seems like every edit here was for a reason. And I suspect the material was so solid to begin with that Harrison had the advantage of using it to enhance rather than conceal something awkward that had taken place in another camera angle. That's just a guess.
Yeah, but full disclosure, Mr. Alvarez, I used to be a film editor.
So you know they're okay. So you get it. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
No, the editors are one of the most.
The word that you used is excellent. The cutaways enhanced the storytelling.
And the editor is one who, it's an unheralded, unappreciated, misunderstood occupation. And I'm glad you're mentioning Mr. Harrison's contribution because it's seamless. I mean, we don't really notice it because it's so seamless and masterful.
Yeah.
Editing is the
okay. Thank you.
part. No one's ever walked out of a movie and said, "Wow, the editing! Oh my God!" You know, because if you, am I right, Damien? You know, I tell my students
maybe
that.
Bonnie and Clyde or Wild Bunch.
It's very, very rare. Yeah,
Yes.
But you're right. It's not the first thing people think about.
It's the invisible art. If people are noticing the editing,
absolutely,
there's something more wrong with the movie than that.
Yeah, the cliche is the editor's job is to take out the bad parts,
right?
Which is so far off the mark, but you know that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Hey,
thanks
thank you
again.
so much.
Appreciate it.
Okay, guys. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Before we end tonight with Sean Moore, I'd like to wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving. Gobble, gobble, gobble.
Happy.
And a happy one. And don't eat too much. And now let me throw it to Sean. Sean?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, you guys. Boy, what a great discussion again. And that reminds me that we deliver a lot of this free, like today was free, and believe it or not, this isn't always free, and we do have some costs involved, and all of that is because of the great donors that we have. Our patrons are great donors, and I want to remind you that November is Giving Month, and if you can, go to newplazacinema.org and think about giving us a donation. We do have a very generous anonymous donor who is matching the first 10,000 that we raise. So if you give 50, it will become 100 immediately. So that would be wonderful if you could think about that. And then if you like this, I think you're going to love what's coming up next as we're focusing on Italy. And you saw the great trailer that Max put together. And so we're looking forward to that. His lecture on Bertolucci on the 1st. And then, of course, on the 5th, when we go into The Conformist, and our special guest that Dan Cahill has so graciously arranged for us is Vittorio Storaro, their cinematographer. So I think you guys are going to love that discussion. It's going to be just amazing. And so thank you so much. Thanks everyone, wherever you are in the United States or across the world. We're so glad that you have found us and that you join us, and tell your friends, because we think this is a fun that should be shared. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you, Sean. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Sean.
Thank you all. Happy Thanksgiving.